I want to talk about this particular topic of point systems and floating because it's something that a lot of people have been asking me about, and especially because of the talks of having more of a unionized structure that TSM, implied that we need to have an official ranking system, and not only that, Leffen and recently talked about top player burnout and floating. So I want to just make this video just to kind of summarize my thoughts in one purposeful video. So first, I'm going to actually talk about floating. And so my principle on floating, is generally this. I think a lot of people misconstrued and coupled together burnout with justification to float. And I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that floating is one of many possible solutions to kind of alleviate some of the emotional stress that that a top player may feel. And I like to kind of explain it for people that are kind of wondering, well, hey, like, is it really that big of a deal? And the big thing here is that the difference between a top player and a person that isn't like kind of in this like celebrity stature is that anybody else can go to their pool, play their matches, and then they can just play. They can play friendlies, warm up, and they just play matches and they leave. Now, for a top player, a top personality such as Leffen, or Mango, the moment they enter a venue, let's say they want to come early to warm up, they are swarmed by people. They are swarmed by autograph requests, and people wanting selfies, asking them questions, asking conversations, and all in all, like, if you think about it, like maybe one or two conversations aren't bad. Like, like if you go to a tournament, you probably are talking to people, but when you're dealing with this nonstop, the moment you enter a venue and then you play your pool and the moment you step out, you're just hounded by people all the time. It is kind of really draining. And it's, imagine like trying to like work at Jamba Juice for 3 hours where you're constantly, on the go, your mind's racing, and then you constantly have to interact and talk with people. It's pretty tiring, and then I understand that some people, that's their mojo. They're extremely extroverted and they love that stuff, but not all the top players are extroverted, and it gets mentally draining when not only are you taking care of this, but you're expected to have the stamina to last another 9 to 10 hours. And some tournaments, they start at like 8 a.m. or 10 a.m. and they finish at 12 a.m. midnight. And so that's like about 14 hours of, straight where they have to be mentally engaged, and that's really tiring. So the point being is that like amongst this, like floating is not the only solution here. It's not one that I firmly advocated on Twitter, and I think that's where a lot of misconceptions came up. And I think what Leffen was bringing up is that if everybody is coming to me as Leffen, with all these expectations, something's going to have to give. If everybody wants an autograph or a selfie or a friendly, if the tournament organizer wants me to play exhibitions, they want me to commentate, they want me to do all that stuff on top of everything else, and they also advance very far in bracket, and they also have to wait for their stream matches, then like they can't perform to the level that they want to do. And so I think it's a pretty legitimate complaint to say, hey, I don't think it's really reasonable to have to be mentally engaged for 14 hours straight. And now the current argument I hear is, yes, this is their job, and they should be doing this. Like they are so lucky. Why are they so entitled? And yes, like a lot of people would kill to live the Leffen dream. But keep in mind, like if you are, I think when we create this environment where they're on their 14th hour and they're expected to continue to play, or 12th hour, 13th hour, whatever, we're not doing our community the best service, because everybody gets robbed, because no one is expected to be at their best conditions. And if we're really going to make this about, oh, like they need to survive and persevere, and that's what a true warrior is, and that's what some FGC guys said, but like, is that what we really want to test, or do we want to see good melee, and do we want to have a good environment that is conducive to having players perform at their absolute best? Imagine where does that line draw then? It's like, do we have people fast and have like sleepless nights to see like who has the true mental stamina? Like they have to like stay up 48 hours straight and then play a set and see who can do the best. Like I think it's kind of a silly metric to say like who can survive the 14-hour marathon and still perform well. I think that's a terrible argument for justification to kind of having these like bad schedules. So the alternate suggestion here is to have VIP rooms, where a player, most of them love fans, but they need a space where they can unwind, they can practice, and they can regain their mental energy back. And sometimes, people take a couple of hours to recoup. And most players are willing to interact, but they also need to recharge. And I think that's the right way to go about it. But if we're to have a system of floating, and I think the only way this really does happen is if we have, a point system, and I'm going to allude to that later. Some people are saying, well, like, hey, where do I draw the line? We should only have the top 8. And I just want to debunk some of the suggestions that are being thrown out there. So I'm going to just kind of bring out some bracket theory and some extreme examples. So if you gave everybody, or like half the field, a float, let's say you had a 1,024-man bracket, and you had 512 people floated, I know that sounds silly, then technically nobody benefits because you're not skipping rounds and it's effectively just like kind of like seeding. But if you have the other extreme where you say like, hey, I only want one person floated in the event, then where you place that person in bracket, if you only float one person, is all the way in winners finals. So the less people you float, the more benefit that targeted few get. Because what happens is, if you want to work out the brackets to be nice, let's say you have 8 people floated into a certain round of winners, then naturally they're going to be in the winners round of 16 because they're going to be competing with 8 other people. 8 plus 8 is 16. And, if you're going to float the top 8, and, you could say, well, like the top 8 is more certain, like floating the top 8 to the final round of 16 in like a 2,000-man event is such a huge advantage. It's borderline unfair. So the idea that you can let's only float a small portion of the population is actually a really terrible idea, because the less people you float, the more benefit each of those people get. Whereas, in the case of Genesis, what happens is, if you float 64 people, they're not getting to top 64. They're in the winners round of 128. So they can still get 97th or 129th, I forget which. And the point being is that when you float more people, yes, it's like, well, like that's such an arbitrary cutoff. Like we're not really sure this person's 64th, or maybe there's someone else that's better. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you float a large portion of the people, then what happens is they get as less benefit overall. So there is a trade-off there. And there's a common argument that's being thrown around, like, hey, like this reduces the probability of upsets. And for the fact that people can only name like 2 to 3 upsets, considering that like we have probably thousands of matches that occur from like a top player and a non-top player, just for the fact that you only have like 2 to 3 or 4 of them means that there's something like a 99% chance that the top player is going to beat the non-top player. But the other argument is that I make in advocating for floating, if I were going to make a case, is that if the person that was capable of making an upset can't even make it to the winners round of top 128, which is not even that far in bracket, then chances are they weren't going to upset that top player anyway, because they lost to another player. And when I'm talking about like the people that could potentially upset, like Infinite Numbers, Milkman, Ginger, these are the type of players that could potentially make it to top 128 and get their opportunity. So for these people that are vying for an upset, frankly, in a 2,000-man tournament, I would say like 1,500 have absolutely no shot at winning against like a Mango or Armada. And then you trim it down to a few people that may take a game. But overall, it doesn't happen enough. And I believe that the small portion of people like Infinite Numbers would make it to that point in bracket where they can make upsets anyway. So that's a really faulty argument. Now, if you're going to make an argument like that, this is not fair. Seeding is an inherently unfair concept as it is. Mango should have an opportunity to play Armada round 1. So if you're going to say, well, we want to be a completely open bracket and floating is not fair, well, seeding is not fair. So if you are an advocate for seeding and you're making that argument, then it's hypocritical. But if you want to say like, oh, to degree, like I feel like it's too much of an advantage. Well, like it's subjective, it's a subjective argument, and I can see where you're coming from. But if you're completely going from the standpoint of this is not fair, well, if you're going to say that floating is not fair, then seeding is inherently unfair because it's a subjective judgment to say who gets the number one seed or who gets seeded and who doesn't have to play the top players. And from a new player standpoint, like if you're like a competitor, like, and some people, they want to play Mango, and I get that. But some people might say like, hey, like it sucks. I got Mango round 1 and I had no chance in winners to advance far because I started in losers so early. Whereas another player could have gone like 4 rounds farther because they didn't run into a top player. And so that's another thing. And overall, this doesn't ruin interaction. I think the way I see it is that if there's ever an event where floating happened, I think there needs to be some sort of trade-off, and this is what Genesis did well. And basically what they did was the really, highly sought-out players, Mango, Mango, PP, Honeybox, and one of the other, big 6 guys, they actually played friendlies nonstop at a dedicated booth for like 2 hours each. And so as opposed to maybe 4 random lucky people that get to play Mango or PPMD, that 1 to 2 hour line gave about 50 people the opportunity to play PP. So 50 new players that come to these events that say like, hey, I really want to play PPMD, like 50 people got a chance to do it as opposed to like the 3 to 4 random people. And I highly doubt that the 4th person that plays in winners round 4 is like a new player to make it that far. So those are the advocates. I'm not saying that floating should happen right now, just to recap, but I've just seen a lot of arguments against it, and I just don't think it's really good enough. I can agree with the fact that we don't have an official point system, so like it's arbitrary, and I agree with that. And so until that point happens, I think that's a fair argument to make against floating. But all these other arguments I'm hearing are honestly like not substantial in my book, as I've just kind of discussed. Now this leads us to our next point about point systems, and this is something that a lot of people have asked me about. And the fundamental thing that I worry about with it is how it shifts player behavior and the notion of objectivity. This is something I've talked about before. Like, if you really want an objective system, Smashboards is actually an objective system. And a lot of people don't like it. And why is that? Because the results don't reflect what people actually think of the results. Is MACD number 9? Actually, would anybody in the world think MACD is number 9? Or would anybody think Wizrobe is number 10? And I think that people want an objective system only if it agrees with their subjective judgment. So I think that people fundamentally don't really know what they want. Some people, yes, but when when objective systems come up, Glyco, to be fair, is a pretty good one. But I gave you an example of Smashboards, and a lot of people reject it, even though it's objective. Shows that there are underlying biases that people have, and even if you have like a numerical system, if it doesn't agree with your preconceived notions, you're going to call it biased to some degree. Now with point systems in seeding, we have to go back to what are the goals. So what do you benefit? What happens if a player is top 16 or top 32? What do they get at an event? Well, how do we agree upon the tournament structure of it? So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of creating a point system that everybody agrees to, and there's a lot of things that from playing in card games that I really worry about. And so the one suggestion that people give is, well, why don't we just use ELO or Glyco? And inherently that sounds like a fair idea, it's just match based, should be accurate. But then you look, let's say we had a circuit, right? And you have to think from the perspective of the top player. Let's say we run a circuit, we have a circuit, and it ends in this large climax of an event. Let's say the last event is $500,000 or something substantial that this is meaningful. What happens with ELO and Glyco is that if you use that as a main system, it actually discourages people from going to events, and because people are going to attempt to gamify it, and they're going to pick and choose ways to maximize their ELO. And so what happens is, let's say you reach a threshold. Let's say you hit Armada hits 2200. At this point, like Armada like is reasonably safe to like make it. Let's say that's an arbitrary number. Now what happens is, let's say like Armada, Mango, and Hungry Box, like win like for the first 4 months of this season, and they're like, okay, like we made enough points to like safely get in. Now what happens is in the second half of the season, they're not going to go to events because why risk like losing points? Because what happens is with ELO, you can lose your rank and you can lose points, because if you lose and you get upset, your ranking goes down. But if you can guarantee yourself good seating early, then the top player doesn't have to go to events anymore. And this is something we really want from the community. You can't really push them, because if the end product is like that, the main event they're trying to qualify for, they already did, then they don't really have an incentive to go to events. The Mango would probably just be streaming. Hungrybox would probably be labbing and practicing secret stuff. Leffen and Armada will probably be like labbing as well and producing strategies. And is this the end product that we want, where an event like Big House doesn't have any of the gods anymore, and a lot of these top players are refusing to go to certain events, and they're going to these like random scattered events so that they can just accumulate points without risking anything. So that's my issue with having ELO combined with like floating and circuit and seeding, is that it actually produces awful gamified behavior, because top players are going to figure out what the optimal strategy is to get the best of what they want. And usually in the case of ELO, you're going to stop attending events. And this is something that used to happen in Pokemon the card game, is that once you hit I think 1800 points, you would just stop attending events. And I don't think that's something that we really want from our top players at the end of the day. And then the other argument is, well, what about event-based placements? Well, Smashboards is actually an example of something that you get points based on your final placement. It's based on some formulas. You get a certain amount of points based on the number of attendees. There's multiple issues with this, and I'll explain through this. MLG was done by this system, and to gamify it the other way, it was to attend as many events as possible, and generally the community census was like 0, soft, and Remen shouldn't have qualified for it. But when you have a point system, like, people are going to find loopholes to get in. So I'm not blaming 0, soft, or Remen for doing what they did to get in, but does it really produce the results we want? And to create result, and somebody out there is probably going to say, like, why don't you guys just think of a good point system? But like, every point system can be exploited in a certain way, and nothing is ever perfect. And if you make it so that only certain large events, get a lot of points, or like you can get a maximum amount of points, this actually screws over people in like Europe and Japan, because they don't have as many good events. And for Europe, we tend to forget as Americans that they have to travel across countries to get to their events that are like substantial, that like Leffen and Armada go to. So you automatically eliminate people like Ice, and you eliminate like AMSA, you eliminate people from other regions, and then it becomes like a US ranking as opposed to a national ranking. People that live in regions that are populated with events are going to have a tremendous advantage. And why the tennis comparison doesn't quite work is that tennis has the money, the sponsor, and the infrastructure for the players to fly around constantly full time to go to as many events as possible, whereas in Smash, you have a case where not even most of the sponsors are going to be willing to fly their players out right now. I would say only the big teams like Mango would fly out. But if you have like a Mike Hayes tier, sponsor, like, they're not going to fly out Mike Hayes to every event. And Mike Hayes recently did, a fundraiser to try to get to CEO. And what this will do for us, if the prize money and the infrastructure is not there, is that this further creates even more top player privilege. And, some people have said, like, I hate floating. It divides the top player privilege even further. But, like, if you have a system that's event-based, this only favors the rich and the people that can attend every event. And these are the people that, A, have the time and have a sponsor that's willing to pour in money. So this will even further separate the gap between the players that have lucrative sponsors, which are usually the best players, and the mid-tier players that, aren't quite there yet, but now they further get screwed over because they don't get they don't have the sponsors and the support to travel to events. And so it's a really tough decision to go about because everything has its pros and cons. I've thought about this endlessly. There's no perfect system, and it's not. I'm not trying to like discourage people to say like, hey, like I don't want a point system. I don't want an ELO ranking to determine seeding. But overall, there are consequences to using each part of the system, and fundamentally, we have to ask ourselves: is this what we really want to control the behavior of the players that are competing? And to just re-emphasize, if we go ELO, this actually discourages top players to go to events and compete against one another. They will take the low risk route and go to events that have nobodies. And so, in the second half of a season, whatever it may be, you're not going to see the big six compete against each other, assuming that they get enough points. And I feel that that is disastrous for us. And point systems will further divide the top players and everybody else because the top players are the only ones that will have resources to go to events. So we have to really think this through and be careful about what we ask for. And so overall, sorry for ranting a little bit, but those are just some of my thoughts that I've had about this whole issue.